I would say journey to reality, sacramental life in a secular age. So I would say that the book is generally about these competing worldviews that are taking place. So before the rise of before the Enlightenment, before the Protestant Reformation in 1517, when Luther nailed the 95 Theses on the door of the church, and before even before 1648, 1648 was really like the line of demarcation, because what happened in 1648? You had the Treaty of Westphalia, which was signed in Germany, which ended the 30 Years' War in Europe. And what had been happening for 30 years, actually, I think more than 30 years, if I'm remembering correctly, the papal states, Germany in particular was divided up into all these little fiefdoms, these princedoms, that were papal states that belonged to the Pope of Rome and the Catholic Church in the West. When Protestantism came 100 or so years before, some of these princes turned to Protestantism. And what then happened was the Protestant fiefdoms went to war with the papal states. And there was this constant conflict and a 30 Years' War that took place. Finally, in 1648, and this war ravaged Central Europe in particular. And then finally, in 1648, with this treaty, what they decided was, look, and really this is the child of Protestantism. What they decided was, we're going to now make the public space, the public square is going to be a neutral zone, a religiously free zone from now on, because the Protestantism, because the church was no longer united in Western Europe, you had these fights between the Protestants and the Catholics. They decided, we're just going to remove religion from the public square and make religion a completely private affair. And this is what we mean when we say secular. So when he talks about sacramental life in a secular age, we live in the post 1648 age that has become secular. And secular means really simply that the public square will be free from religion. And so you have the American Revolution and the French Revolution are kind of the outworkings of this new secular age, where you have the separation of church and state, which before that time, every nation had an official established church. So we're living in this age where religion has been removed from the public and has become a completely private affair. And especially here in America, where we're very individualistic, religion has become an individual affair. There's really not such a thing as religious community anymore. Even if you see, even someone like Billy Graham, he would preach to people, and then he would, once they converted individually, once they had this individual conversion experience, he would say, okay, now go find a church. But for many people, I've talked to many of these people, church is kind of an extra optional thing. So this is why the secular age that we live in now, since 1648, is so different from the worldview pre-1648. Pre-1648, and we're only really talking about in the West here. In the East, in the Eastern Church, we really never went through the Enlightenment. And we never had a split with a Protestant type group. So in many ways, this is the reason, for example, you see in Greece, that there still is a national church in Greece. There's not a separation of church and state. I was a priest in Greece and I was paid by the government. I was a government employee. And you see this in Russia now, for example, where even though under communism, you had this radical split of church and state. Now, because they really never went through the Enlightenment, you have this reconfiguring of church and state again in Russia. This is kind of an Orthodox phenomenon because we never went through this Enlightenment period. So what he's trying to argue here is, one, he wants to make us aware of our secular age. And the presuppositions that we have about religion being a private affair, about it not being involved with the state or in the public square. And then he wants to contrast that to this kind of sacramental view of reality. And this is what he's saying is real, is the sacramental view. So what does he mean by sacramental? So, well, one thing that happened as a result of secularism and the removal of religion from the public sphere is you can see this, I try to make this practical to people. So you can see, for example, the outworkings of this. If you look at anything that's public, so like a church, right, which is open to the public, at least in theory. If you go to a Protestant church that is the product of this secular age, what do you see in there? You see four white walls generally, right? You see very little adornment. It's been stripped of religious significance, and you compare it to the Catholic or Orthodox Church. There's no iconography, there's no statues, there's the religious symbolism that is so in your face in a Orthodox or Catholic church has been stripped away because of the secularism. The clergy, the clergy always wore distinct dress in both the East and the West, but as a result of secularism, now they dress just like everybody else. They wear skinny jeans and are hipsters now. So.
I'm real happy you don't.
Yeah, should be. So you have this removal of anything that has religious symbolism, in the churches and the clergy, in our view of time even, in the ancient view of time, every day was a feast day. Every day was a feast day of a saint or a feast of the Lord. And now, and Sunday was the day of the resurrection. Now there's a church that I've heard of here in Birmingham where they meet on Tuesday nights in a warehouse. That's the product of secularism. That's secularism. That's because all time has been stripped of all sacramentality, right? There's nothing sacred about time. There's nothing sacred about space. There's nothing sacred about people. There aren't certain people who are selected out to be clergy, etc. There aren't certain days that are selected out. Every day is the same. So why not have it on Tuesday, right? Why not have it in a warehouse? Because this is what secularism is. So secularism, a lot of times we use the term only in a negative sense, meaning atheistic, but it's really not what secular means. Secular means this neutral zone in the public sphere. So that a reality that's been stripped of any kind of sacredness. And that's a big problem for us as Orthodox, right? So we live in this kind of schizophrenia here in the modern West, where we live in an age that's completely secular, but we have a religion that is just replete with with religious symbolism. So how do we negotiate that as Christians? What we could say, I'll just say this last thing about symbolism. Pre-1648, symbol in the Greek the word was symboli, which means to throw together. And symbol meant something that was real. It was actually more real than anything else. So when you saw an icon of the Lord, it was a symbol of the Lord, but it actually manifested the Lord's presence in a sacred way, right? Now that that's been stripped away, now if you were to even find an icon of the Lord or a picture of the Lord, it no longer has any kind of sacramental value. There's nothing sacred about it. Although Father Stephen Freeman often says that in Appalachia, no one's told them that this is wrong according to Protestantism, but they'll often have pictures of the Lord, usually with the crown of thorns or something.
And the Sacred Heart is that.
And the Sacred Heart, right? Because there's this kind of yearning, I think, within humans naturally to attach religious symbolism and for the sacred. We want the sacred, but our society has removed it from us.
The second paragraph on page 11 is kind of a good synopsis.
You want to read it?
This is the sense in which early Christians used the word mystery. They did not mean something that could not be known, but something that could be known only by participation, by entering into it and understanding it from the inside, like marriage, a friendship, or a family. It's no wonder that the term came to describe this kind of religious experience was sacramental, from the Latin word for mystery. This was the heart and soul of the early church and formed the foundation of Christianity in the ancient world.
Yeah. So you see, for example, when the bread and the wine are symbols, in the ancient sense of the word symbols, of the body and blood of Christ, meaning that they really are the body and blood of Christ, but at the same time, they don't cease to be bread and wine, right? This is kind of the quintessence of sacramentality, what it means to be sacramental.
So, and I apologize, because I didn't know where you were coming to my side, I read it. But isn't there an aspect of secularism that where they develop their own institutions, dogmas, and sacraments to know themselves?
Sure.
Because
Yeah.
you're saying like it's devoid entirely of this, of sacrament. But maybe that's something else entirely, I'm just not sure.
Well, can you give me, do you have an example in mind?
Well, certain sociological beliefs, scientific beliefs, and they build, I mean,
Yeah.
people are I mean, we cancel people all the time, right?
Right.
If you don't conform to whatever that
That's,
view is.
it's one thing I noticed, I was a religious studies major, so we studied all kind of religious, movements and what makes a religion a religion. And one thing I noticed back when I was studying it was when Ronald Reagan died. When Ronald Reagan died, he was put in a casket, he was shipped around the country, and people would line up for hours to go venerate his coffin. Why? Because this is a natural, I would argue, this is because it's a natural human instinct to make something sacramental. It's just, it's not something logical, it's just something that people feel compelled to do. And that would be a kind of secular sacrament, where we turn a politician into a kind of revered.
Well, it's kind of like they're rejecting religious institutions, dogmas, and sacraments, and replacing it with something else entirely, but
Yeah.
it's still that yearning for belonging, confirmation, affirmation.
Ritual.
Yeah.
I mean, even you look at our sports, we sing the national anthem to begin with, there's a ritual aspect to sports events. So, yeah, I see what you're saying.
Auburn, Alabama.
Yeah,
Whatever, yeah. Something to attach to and identify with.
yes. Yeah, but religiously though, we've been, I would say, impoverished, symbolically. All right, you wanna start us off? Yeah,
What is religion? One of the most fundamental differences between ancient and modern people is how they think about religion. For modern people, it's very common to think of religion as a matter of personal preference, like any other consumer choice. My brother loves watching movies. Someone might say, but I prefer video games. Or my roommate loves rock climbing, but I prefer lifting weights. Is this way of thinking? There are right or wrong answers. It's simply a question of what works for you. The only standard is, one woman told me, as long as it makes you happy. Other people have said whatever brings you peace, gets you through the day, and so forth. Well, this is a fine approach to some areas of life. So to treat religion in this consumerist or medicative manner is to misunderstand its purpose. Ancient people did not treat religion as this way. For the ancients, your religion was not the answer to the question, what works for you or what makes you happy? It was the answer to the question, what is the nature of reality?
yeah, I'll just say here that when I was in Greece, I noticed, there's this kind of pre-enlightenment way of thinking about religion and sacramentality. And when I would tell people, that I was American, they would assume I was Greek American, and I would say, no, my roots are from England. And I became Orthodox. And I remember one woman in particular actually said, can you do that? Is that allowed? Because in their mind, religion is not a choice, right? Religion is part of your identity. It's a communal event. And to personally, individually decide to change your religion is almost inconceivable. Because it would be an affront to your family, it would be an affront to your culture, to your history, etc. So really a totally different mentality than we have as Americans, where it's what makes you happy, what floats your boat, etc.
And our question probably related to culture as well, or the Greek
Yeah.
culture
Yeah.
in particular. Yeah.
Christine, you wanna read?
Yeah, understand that this is only partially a scientific question. It goes well beyond scientific concerns such as what atoms and molecules are made out of, how gravity works, or the behavior of quantum particles. Rather, this inquiry is directed at the ultimate questions. What is the meaning of life? Why do things exist at all? Who are we? And what is our purpose? Did you want to speak to that, or do you want me to keep reading? Okay, I know that some people treat such questions flippantly, thinking they are impractical, but that is not true. The question of meaning in life is perhaps the most practical question of all, which I think should be even more apparent in the wake of a modern epidemic of depression and anxiety, to say nothing of suicides or shootings. There is a vast, complicated universe out there. What is its meaning? Whatever your answer, everything else about reality, science, history, literature, economics is bound up in it. That's why it's correct to say that the central issue with which religion is concerned is the nature of ultimate reality.
Tommy?
Because what we mean by God, because this question is so important, every culture in history has attempted some kind of answer. Curiously, in what seems to be the overwhelming majority of cases, that answer has something to do with mysterious power, what we call God in English. But here's our first difficulty. The word God is somewhat ambiguous in our language and in many others, and people use it in different senses without realizing it. There are two distinct senses in which you could use the word God. On the one hand, you could use the word usually with an uppercase G to refer to a single supreme deity. On the other hand, you could use the word often with a lowercase g to refer to deities that are not single and all powerful, but instead have distinct personalities like Zeus, Thor, Ganesh, or Matarasu. Confusing these two definitions is what leads to many misunderstandings about religion. You have heard people say things like, I stopped believing in God when I grew up, along with Santa Claus and the Tooth Fairy. Or some people ask, if God exists, where is he? And then look around with exaggerated incredulity. There was even a prominent scientist who said that the reason he didn't believe in God is that humanity had been exploring outer space for decades and still hadn't run into the bearded old man. While such comments may seem witty, they only show that the speaker is confused about the basic terminology of the discussion. To make things clear, let's use the word God to refer to entities like Zeus, Thor, Matarasu, but we'll use a completely different word for what Christianity is trying to talk about. Arche. This is an old Greek word that means first or primary, as in archenemy or archangel, but it could be translated beginning, source, or principle. What's the difference between a god and arche or arch? When we talk about the gods, what we're talking about are particular entities within the universe. Granted, these may be very powerful entities, superhuman in their abilities and the scope of their powers. They may live for countless generations of men. They may even be involved in shaping or governing the world as we know it, but they nevertheless share much in common with us. They have limitations on their powers. They can be slain, as in many ancient myths, and they have all too human traits such as jealousy, lust, anger, and pride. But most importantly, like us, they're creatures, meaning that they are part of the universe and ultimately dependent on it, just as we are. The difference is simply one of power. Despite their sometimes profound contributions to shaping and governing the world, the gods are unmistakably in the world and are to some extent bound by it.
You can pass.
Okay.
Did you read for both of us?
Yeah.
Okay. Perfect. The arche by contrast is exactly the opposite. The arche is not any particular being in the universe in the sense of something we can point to or identify, nor does it exist beyond this universe in some higher universe of its own. The arche is not a thing in the sense that you, a dog, or Zeus are things. Such things are part of the universe, exist in space-time, are limited in what they are, and depend on something else for their being. But the arche is not part of any universe. It is outside of space-time, is unlimited, and has no source of existence. What this last part means is that far from being any particular thing in the universe, the arche is itself the source of all reality and being. It is, as you might say, being itself or reality itself. It's difficult to put this into words, but you can see that it's because of the nature of what we're trying to describe. Because the arche is not an object or item in the universe, any analogy we make to objects or items will be ultimately inadequate. There are, however, two images that may be helpful. One comparison is that the arche is like life in the sense of being alive. Suppose you walk into a park in springtime, and on seeing the dragonflies, birds, and squirrels, along with all the blooming flowers and plants, you say the park is teeming with life, or that life is in the air. What is this life you're talking about? It's true that the park is full of living creatures, but there is no particular thing or object you can point to and say, that there is life. Life can't be any particular plant or animal in that park, but it is something that everything there has. It's the power or principle in which all of those things share and by which they are able to live. It is the same with existence. There are many things that exist, but the principle or power by which they exist is not one of those things. The power is what we mean by the arche. A second example is light. Most of the time, you don't perceive light directly. You know that light is present primarily because you are able to see other things, which the light has illuminated. If you are in a completely dark room and suddenly the light turns on, you know the light came on because now you see a couch, walls, a desk, and so on. Light is the medium by which you are able to see anything at all. Life and light are, incidentally, two of the most common analogies that have been used to describe the arche throughout history. The analogies are, as I've warned, ultimately inadequate. A more accurate, though more abstract way of putting it is that the arche is the ultimate principle of reality. It is the power from which everything flows and in which everything has its being.
Alright, so everyone, everyone following along with his argument here, it's kind of a little bit boring, but he's building up an argument for later, so we gotta plow through it. But anybody have any comments on that? I mean, one thing I started was, when he says that, it does not, nor does it exist beyond this universe in some higher universe of its own. And this made me think of Father Stephen Freeman's book about everywhere present, and what which is a quote from the prayer we always say, "O Heavenly King, comfort the Spirit of truth, who are everywhere present, filling all things." So in the Orthodox idea, we have this, we call it pan-in-theism, not pantheism, which means that everything is God, but that rather that God is in everything. And that's an important distinction, and that leads to the sacramental view of the world. So Saint Gregory Palamas talked about the in essence energies distinction. So God in his essence is not everywhere present, but but in his energies, he's everywhere present and fills all things. And this is what leads to this symbolism that makes something really real. Does that make sense? All right.
We don't want to skip.
Oh, yeah, right.
The arcade gods. You can see now why the arcade is not even in the same category as things like Zeus or Thor. Such gods are actually in the same category as dogs or rocks, that is, specific objects in the universe. We can ask the question, where did Thor come from? The answer being something like he was born of Odin. But we cannot ask this question of the arcade in the same sense. To ask where the arcade came from is more like asking where the being came from. You might be tempted to confuse this last question with the question, where did the universe come from? And think that because we know how babies and clouds and planets are formed, we are on our way to figuring out the explanation for where everything in the universe came from. That is a different question. We're not asking how individual objects in the universe came into being, or even how every individual object came to be. Our question is about the mysterious phenomenon of existence itself. A question which still cannot be answered even if we knew the individual causes of every object in the universe. There is a sense in which most ancient cultures believed in both the arche and the gods. It's not the ancient pagans, like Greeks or Egyptians, believed in many divinities, while Christians and Jews believed in only one. Most Greeks would believe in the arche just as they believed in the gods. And Christians or Jews, while articulating their respective notions of the arche, would also have believed in a whole myriad of superhuman unseen powers that governed or interfered with the world, mighty archangels, malevolent demons, burning seraphim, austere cherubim, and so forth. In other words, creatures that a Greek would have immediately identified as gods.
That makes sense. All right, Sarah?
Early Christian thinkers noticed this similarity. St. Augustine even went so far as to say that the pagans used the word gods to mean the same thing, things that the Christians called angels. He didn't think this was a problem because the lower gods obviously belong to a completely different category from the one God who is the arche. We see this distinction in almost all the great religious and philosophical traditions. Though they call the arche by different names, Tian in Chinese, Brahman in Hinduism, the absolute in modern philosophy, and so on, they all had a clear understanding of the difference between things in the world and that power or principle by which the world is sustained and has its being. This idea, the idea of the arche, is what Christians mean when they use the English word God with a capital G. So then when we ask about whether there is a God in this sense, we are not asking whether there is some specific superhuman entity that orders or governs the universe. That is thinking far too small. We are asking about the arche of all being, the source, the principle, the thing that is being itself. This is the highest and most important of all questions. There is nothing the answer does not affect.
Right, so in the Old Testament, in Exodus, when Moses is at the burning bush and he asks God his name, and God responds Yahweh, which means Oon in Greek, the I am who I am, the one who is, something like that. So this is the very name of God, is that he is being itself, he is existence, in the Jewish Christian concept. All right. Now,
Now maybe on Dr. Lighthouse. I'll
Yeah.
pass to Dr. Lighthouse.
Thank you, Doctor.
Yes.
Who is God? The moral reality of the arche. There is a sense in which the idea of the arche is not that hard to understand. If you think about it as life or being, then it's easy to distinguish it from deities like Zeus or Thor. Most ancient religions thought of that arche either as some sort of divine substance out of which the universe emerged, or as a mysterious force that governed reality, or both. Many ancient thinkers also understood the arche as moral. The ultimate cosmic source of all life and being was, they thought, also the source of all morality. In other words, the arche was not just reality itself, but also goodness itself. While they differed on the exact nature of the arche and the extent to which you could interact with it, almost all ancient cultures had some idea of an ultimate source or principle for both the physical world and the moral world, and often they understood them as the same thing. You see the same kind of idea when contemporary people talk about the universe in vaguely moral terms. I think the universe is trying to tell me something, or the universe wants me to do such and such thing.
or when they talk about karma or something like that, yeah.
The personal God. The early Christians, however, went a step further than this. They believed that the arche was also personal. That is, the arche was not just a governing force or animating principle, but also a person with a mind and a will. You might think that when I say a person, we're now back to talking about a certain specific entity in the universe, like Zeus or Thor, and that to say the arche is a person means that some entity in the universe also happens to be the ultimate power. But that is not the Christian idea. Let's say I bring you a rock and tell you, this is not just a rock, it's also a person. When you look at the rock, you see that it indeed has qualities you associate with a person, such as being able to think and speak and interact with you. We could imagine the same thing on a bigger scale, such as a whole mountain, that it was not just a mountain, but also a person. If you can imagine that, you can probably also imagine that our entire planet could be a person with its own thoughts and will. We could maybe even imagine that the universe, in whatever sense we can talk about the universe as a single object, could also be a person. However, this is not what we mean when we say that the arche is a person. We're not taking some object, a rock, a mountain, a planet, and adding the idea of personhood to it. We're saying that the ultimate governing principle of reality, distinct from the created universe, is personal. There is a famous story from the Bible that's helpful in understanding this. When God appeared to Moses and told him to lead the Israelites out of Egyptian captivity, Moses asked for God's name so that he could tell the Israelites who it was that sent him. The name God told him was I am. This was not God describing something true about himself, for of course you could say the same thing about yourself. Rather, God was giving his name. I know many of our names for people who things can seem arbitrary, but a good name tells you something about the thing you're naming. This is how nicknames usually happen. A girl with red hair gets called Red. A tall man named George gets called Big George, and so on. Likewise, the name God gave Moses was one that corresponded with his nature. I am. In other words, to exist, or better yet, to be existent itself, is God's nature. Want to continue? I can continue.
Yeah, sure.
The one or the many? All right, you might say, so what? Why does it matter that the he is a person? To understand the significance of this, we have to ask something basic. What do we mean by person? As with most things, it depends on whom you ask, and different cultures have given different answers. However, we can categorize almost every answer into one of two general worldviews. The first view is that we might call a worldview of the one. This is the belief that all people, and indeed all of reality, ultimately constitute one single being. People who believe this would say that the distinction between one person and another is an illusion caused by our lack of knowledge. If we were enlightened, that is, if we really understood reality as it is, we would see that there is no ultimate difference between any persons or things at all. All are one, they might say, even if we appear to be different. In this view, persons are like water. Water droplets appear to be separate and distinct, but if you put them together, they merge seamlessly into one pool of water, all their distinctiveness instantly melting away. In this view, the arche is the ultimate source of all water, is water itself, and we individual water droplets have been separated from the arche and are trying to merge back into it. This view was common in the ancient world and lives on today in religions such as Hinduism.
And Buddhism, yeah.
The opposite worldview is what we might call a worldview of the many. In this worldview, the primary reality is that of individuals. Distinctions between people are not illusions. They are the main way you know who you are. I am me precisely because I'm not you. I am distinct, self-sufficient, and independent of all other individuals. So much so that we might call this view a kind of radical individualism. Individuals can enter into relationships with one another, but ultimately they are their own beings, separate and distinct. Rather than water droplets, persons in this view are more like stones. Each stone is totally distinct from every other stone, and while you can put them next to each other, stack them, or build something with them, there is no way to merge them together as you can with water droplets. You could grind them up and make them into powder, but then they would not be stones anymore. In other words, the only way to get them to merge together would be to utterly destroy their identity as stones. In this view, the arche might be like one huge stone, and we individual persons might be like parts of the stone that have broken off. But unlike water, once you are broken off, you can merge back with the original stone. You are forever separate and distinct, both from the arche and from all other stones. Both of these worldviews seem to explain an important element about the world we find ourselves in, but each does so at a cost. The worldview of the one explains, truly enough, that there is some kind of fundamental unity among all people and all things, but it does so at the cost of our individualism. Persons cannot really exist in this view. Our distinctiveness turns out to be an illusion, as our very nature means that we belong to a greater whole that has no place for our individuality. If a drop of water falls into the ocean, the drop ceases to exist, and there is no way to get it back. In a worldview of the many, we get to preserve our individuality, but at the cost of any sense of unity. Because in this view, you don't share a connection with any other person at the level of ultimate reality. There is a sense in which you will always be alone, despite however many connections or relationships you make. And in fact, this needs to be so in order to preserve your individual uniqueness. Otherwise, you will just melt into other people and disappear, the way water droplets do. Neither of these views paints a complete picture of the way we experience reality, and still less do they resolve the problem of how to understand the arche as a person. Are all selves ultimately one? If so, then there is no such thing as individual persons. We are all just fragments of one supreme consciousness. And are all servers ultimately separate? If so, then whether or not the archie is a person, or even whether or not any other person exists, is largely irrelevant, since only you as a person matter. You become the center of your own universe, independent but alone. In order to transcend the limitation of both these views, we need a worldview that can combine the best features of the one and the many without being one of them. I think that statement, you become the center of your own universe, independent but alone, I think it is
Yeah.
powerful statement.
Yeah, I think, and in the West, I think that's, we are more of the many, and in the Eastern hemisphere, let's say, it's more of the one. But I think that's why we see so much loneliness and isolation and depression is because of this kind of hyper worldview of the many, that we're all individuals and not persons. And so this is where he's going with this, is they're gonna make, and comes from Metropolitan John Zuzoulis, who is one of the biggest theologians of the last century. He wants to make a distinction between individual and person. So individuals can be self-existing, self-sufficient. Persons, however, are individual, but they need communion. They require communion. They're socially programmed, let's say. And so, and this whole issue of the one and the many, it goes all the way back to pre-Socratic philosophers in Greece. I mean, this is a question that's vexed philosophers for centuries and centuries. But the Christian faith finds a unique solution to this one and the many.
Now, I was gonna ask about the communion that we
Yeah.
have with all of us, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah,
There is one worldview that does this, and that's the ancient Christian idea that the arche is a trinity. How and why the early Christians came to this conclusion is a story of its own. If you are interested, you will no doubt look into it more thoroughly. For now, I only want to give a brief overview of this idea, and more importantly, explain why it matters. The formula that early Christians developed to explain the Trinity is that God is three persons in one essence. They identified the three persons as the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. These three persons are fully distinct from each other. The Father is not the Son is not the Spirit, and so on. However, they are not separate because they all have the same essence. Indeed, they share the same essence so completely that we can correctly call them one God, three persons. At this point, you may perhaps unconsciously be creating a simplification of the concept in your mind. People have been trying to do this for thousands of years. I get what you're saying about three different persons, a Muslim once told me, but really the main thing is the one God, right? He was ready to accept the persons of the Trinity as different faces of God or different roles that God plays, as long as what we were really talking about was one God. But you could also take this to the opposite view. You could say that the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit are actually three different gods who seem like one because they're always in perfect agreement and always do everything together.
so these were in fact very early heresies in the history of the church. This overemphasis on the three, or this overemphasis on the one, and in the East and the West, even from the fourth century and before, the eastern and the western parts of the empire, the Greek versus the Latin parts of the empire, had different emphases. So the East tended to emphasize the threeness, whereas the West tended to emphasize the oneness, but they had to find a way to merge these. But going too far in one direction or too far in the other, like the Muslim wants to do, it falls into heresy. So you're on this kind of razor's edge on the balance.
Wasn't there a time when they had the argument about putting the word son in the creed?
Right, or in the filioque,
In the filioque.
yeah, but even before that, there were already issues about how to understand the three and the oneness, and both, there were sides that it was called modalism, actually, was the name of the heresy, was the idea that God was really one, but that he had three modes, or three kind of faces or personas that you took on depending on necessity. Right, but that was rejected by the church very early on. All right. Amy?
Both of these views are errors, but they are easy to make. They're so easy, in fact, that we often make them without realizing it. We do this by unconsciously prioritizing either the oneness or the threeness, even by just a hair. But there are problems both ways. If you prioritize the oneness, then the persons disappear and you get one divine being. If you prioritize the threeness, then one arche disappears and you get three different gods. Both of these views were rejected by many simultaneously. But how does that make sense? One way to understand it is to compare the Trinity to a family. A family is made up of distinct persons, but the members of a family share the same genetic makeup. This is why family members look alike, have similar traits and tendencies, and so on. In the case of the children, they are literally made out of the same biological material as their parents. So this is a sense in which a family, while being made up of distinct individuals, also shares something that is fundamental. That is a fundamental part of their being, the medium of their biology. A family is in this way simultaneously one family but many people. Now, just as with analogies to the arche, analogies to the Trinity are always going to be inadequate. The Trinity is not the same as a family because the Trinity has one essence in a way that a family does not. To understand the Trinity more accurately requires a much more technical answer. But in my experience, that is not what most people are interested in. What most people want to know is something very simple. Why does any of this matter? The answer is also very simple and very pertinent. If God weren't a Trinity, there would be no such thing as love.
That's a really important one.
Yeah.
Yeah. Because precisely the other must exist in order for me to love. Love implies a relationship. So getting to this idea of persons in communion, that we require other persons in order to express love. So, and the love starts in the Trinity. And in fact, all of creation is considered by our theology as this overabundance, this overflowing of love that exists within the Trinity. So like in a similar way, we would say that, sometimes when we explain to little kids, why a mother and a father have children in the first place, you say, because they love each other so much, they wanted to create another life, something like that. So the Trinity, there's so much love within the Trinity that it overflowed into creation.
One of the major problems with both the worldview of the one and the worldview of the many is that neither has any room for love, at least not as we want to understand it. In a worldview of the one, where we're all just water droplets, the sentence "I love you" is meaningless, since there is ultimately no difference between I and you. If all beings were one, the universe would simply be one being in love with itself. The worldview of the many has the opposite problem. In this view, "I love you" translates to something like, "I am having a particular emotional experience of you." Because we're ultimately separate beings, love can't be something we truly share. What we mean by love is actually two separate experiences. My experience of you and your experience of me. And if you ever watched a movie in which someone loves someone that doesn't love them back, you know that these two experiences don't necessarily line up. The Trinity, however, is the best of both. The Father, the Son, and the Spirit can love each other because each is his own person, distinct from the others. There is I in you. At the same time, however, their love isn't merely an individual emotional experience they're having of one another. Their love for each other is the same love because the three of them share one single essence. I'm aware that this doesn't make immediate intuitive sense to most modern people, but that's because of the way we define the person. When modern people use the term person, we mean it as a symbol synonymous with individual. In other words, we unconsciously assume the worldview of the many, in which each person is a totally separate entity. If that's your assumption, then the idea of three persons sharing one essence sounds like a contradiction. But the ancient Christian idea was different. For them, a person was, by definition, a relational thing. To be a person meant to be defined by your relationship to other persons. You probably have a sense of this already. If you've noticed how you tend to be influenced by the people around you. If you spend a lot of time with certain people, you generally pick up their mannerisms, vocabulary, inflections, and even their sense of humor. Outlook toward life or beliefs. You want me to keep on?
No, I was just gonna say that, for example, again, use Greece as an example or as like a foil to the modern Western culture. In Greece, you know, when you meet somebody, Dr. Vlachos, maybe you can back me up on this, but when you meet somebody, the first questions you ask are not like we in America, well, what do you do for a living? The first questions you ask is, where are you from? Who's your family? In other words, what is your network of relationships? And the answer is, I'm the son of so-and-so, I'm the mother of so-and-so, I'm the father, I'm the friend of so-and-so. You know, because you're drawing, if you picture like, you know, 1,000 points in the sky, you're drawing lines, connecting yourself to all these other points, which gives you a fixed identity, right? Because you've connected to all these other fixed points. Whereas in the modern world, we tend the self, it tends to be this kind of free floating point, which just kind of revolves around itself and is detached from any other points of stable reference, right? And this includes God too, in many ways. In the modern West, you know, with atheism, not only do we not have stable relationships with, you know, extended families like you have in maybe Eastern cultures like Greece, but even the relationship, that vertical line that you draw that creates stability with God is no longer there. So you really have you're this kind of free floating entity which has no stable point of reference. All right, so let's see. The Christian idea of the person is like this, but even more so. The idea is that at the deepest level of our being, we define each other and even bring each other into existence. You'll notice that it takes two humans to make another human. That's always seemed very significant to me. Even your existence, you owe not to one, but to two other people coming together out of a passionate desire for each other. This is an important clue to our nature. Our love for one another expressed physically leads to the creation of new human persons. You literally owe your existence to a relationship. The word we might use to describe this concept is interdependence. Often we can't define one thing without defining another thing first. To understand what a beetle is, you need to understand what an insect is. And to understand what an insect is, you need to understand what an animal is, and so on. But sometimes two things are mutually definitional to one another, like father and son. To be a father means to have a child, and at the same time, to be a son means to have a father. Each term needs the other to have meaning. And as you may have noticed, father and son are the names of two persons in the Trinity. The idea that mankind is a single family made up of many members is a kind of faint reflection of the ultimate reality of God's nature, because even the arche itself is a community of interdependent persons united in perfect love. Make sense? All right. It's important to understand that when early Christians talked about love, they didn't just mean a feeling. Their idea of love was infinitely more solid than that. They saw love as a description of what it means to be a person, of the way we are unified at the most fundamental level of our being, both in relation to one another, since mankind is ultimately one family, and also in relation to God. In other words, they didn't view love as a feeling at all, but as a way of being. What they meant by love was the living, dynamic state of being in which we are both distinctly ourselves and simultaneously united to others. You may have heard a married person say to his or her spouse, "I always love you, even if I don't always like you." You see that? Chuck, what are you laughing about?
I get, I don't love you and I don't like you.
Yeah, not true.
You see that what the speaker means by love actually has nothing to do with his or her feelings. Love is a description of being both one and many simultaneously. This is exactly how ancient Christians understood God. One of the most famous biblical passages on this topic is the phrase, "God is love," 1 John 4:8. The author of this passage, the Apostle John, was not using hyperbolic language to say God is loving, nor was he saying God loves you. Or if you follow this religion, you'll feel a lot of positive, loving emotions. He was making a statement about being. God is love. And now you have some sense as to why. And because we're still talking about the arche, that means the nature of reality itself is love. This is the central idea of Christianity from which everything else follows. Many people think Christianity is just another monotheistic religion, one with its own special twist, the divinity of Jesus, but ultimately a variation on the same theme as religions like Islam or contemporary Judaism. The reality is that Christianity is profoundly different from every other religion in history, precisely because the Trinity solves this problem of the one and the many on the basis that God's nature is love. No other religion has ever made a claim like that. The Trinity is complicated, and people are often tempted to downplay its importance for the sake of presenting a simple, easy to understand theology. But people who do this are in fact talking about some other religion than Christianity, usually one they've made up themselves, whether they meant to or not. We're not here to talk about simplified or made up religions. We're here to talk about Christianity as it was authentically believed and articulated by its earliest followers. And they believed that the arche of all being was a trinity of persons, united in one essence and existing as a perfect, loving community. That is where we must start, because that's where, for Christianity, reality starts. We got 10 minutes. Should we read a little bit more, or are you guys tired?
No.
You wanna read?
When ancient cultures, myth of Eden. When ancient cultures wanted to explain the world, they almost always did so through stories. This isn't because they were unsophisticated or ignorant, but because their whole way of thinking about the world was deeply infused with meaning. In our modern world, we usually make an effort to remove meaning from our picture of the world. We explain things by appealing to blind process like the law of the nature of physics, things that happen just because. This method always allowed us to explain a great deal of how things happen in the universe, but does not help to explain why. The reason is that why is a question about the inerrant and ultimate meaning of things, a question that is beyond the preview of scientific analysis. In the Greek story of Prometheus, for example, man's use of fire is first taught to him by the Titan god Prometheus, who is subsequently punished by Zeus. The story is not really an explanation of how man learned to use fire. It's a narrative about the meaning of reality. It tells us that fire is powerful as well as dangerous, and the divine insight is required to discover and invent. If you conceive of fire or insight as a divine thing and a gift from God, from the gods, then you're suddenly caught up in a world of deeper meaning. You have, in effect, become part of the living story, with all the thematic complexity, relationships, and more content that entails. We call this kind of narration myth, not because we mean that it's untrue, but because the explanations offered are not just about how. Sometimes they aren't about how at all, but they address the why, the deep moral fabric of reality.
So I'm reading this book now, this huge book called The Master and the Emissary by Ian McGilchrist. Have you guys ever heard of him? He's a psychiatrist from Britain. And anyway, he's talking a lot about, he's done a lot of research as a psychiatrist on the right and left hemispheres of the brain. And basically his argument is that we in the modern West are very left brain, which is left hemisphere, which means that we are, the left hemisphere kind of specializes in language, categories, analysis, seeing the particular, focusing on details. But what he says is that myth and literature in general and art plays more in the right brain, the opposite hemisphere, and that the right brain is able to, its specialty is to see the big picture, in other words, and to understand things more intuitively. So I think, I think it's hard for us to get back to how the early Christians viewed things, because we were taught to be so left brain, which is good for many things. It's good for technological progress, etc. But we lose the power of the right hemisphere, which gives us kind of the big picture and allows us to appreciate beauty and truth in art and literature and in myth. Myth doesn't mean untrue, which is how we often take it. It means that it's trying to explain something that's ineffable through a story.
Notice also that scientific and mythic explanations are not fundamentally at odds with one another, as some people think. In fact, they're operating along two different dimensions. Scientific explanations are concerned with the how and never with the why. The myth is almost always the opposite. Something could have both a scientific and mythic explanation, and they would not need to contradict one another, just as the height and weight of an object need not be correlated. And if you have only the height or only the weight of an object, you won't have a complete picture of it. One of the most common why questions that myths address is the origin of evil and suffering in the universe. All ancient mythologies address this question in one way or another. And Genesis, the first book in the Bible, explains it in the episode known as the Fall. You probably know the gist of the story. God created the universe and everything was perfect. There was no suffering or evil. God made the first two humans, Adam and Eve, and placed them in the Garden of Eden and told them they could do whatever they wanted except eat the fruit of a certain tree. But unfortunately, a serpent lied to Adam and Eve, tricking them into eating the fruit, even though they knew they weren't supposed to. So God cast them out of the garden and put a curse on them so that they would have to work hard for their food, suffer their whole lives, and eventually die. And somehow this also caused evil and death to enter the world at large, if only they hadn't eaten that fruit. If you're very familiar with the story, you probably don't appreciate the extent to which it could sound ridiculous. Many people have made fun of it over the years. Evil and death entered the world just because Adam and Eve made one little mistake? And why did God have to be so harsh about it? People have tried to explain the story in different ways, but many of the explanations aren't compelling. They usually emphasize punishment for a crime, which makes some amount of sense, but isn't a satisfying explanation. It certainly doesn't explain why the punishment had to be so severe. In sacramental Christianity, however, there is a much deeper meaning to the story. To understand what's going on with the fall, we need to go back to the distinction we made in earlier chapters between the archie and everything else. All things exist because the archie creates and sustains them, since the archie is being itself, and all things have their being from it. There are two separate categories, that which is created and that which is uncreated. While the archie is being itself, and therefore can have a creator or even a beginning, created things are, by definition, entirely dependent on the archie for their being. The situation becomes more complicated when you give a created thing free will. God created man in his image, and one of the things that means is that man has freedom. God is himself a trinity of persons freely giving and receiving love to and from one another. For humans to have the possibility of being in a loving relationship with God or with each other, they must be able to choose those relationships freely. Freedom is necessary for love. You would not, for example, call someone your friend if that person was forced to be your friend. God gave mankind this freedom, but that also entailed the possibility of our refusing to have a relationship with him. However, choosing not to be in a relationship with God has certain natural consequences. Notice what the serpent tells Eve in the Genesis story. In trying to persuade her to eat the fruit, he says, "You shall be gods," lowercase g. This is the real significance of Eve taking the fruit. It's not simply about doing something you were told not to do, or even about being your own boss. It's about the desire to replace God with yourself, to become your own archie, the source of your own life and being. The deeper meaning of what Adam and Eve did in the garden is that they made a radical break with God, not just by disobeying a rule, but in the voluntary act of choosing to separate themselves from God at the level of their being in order to become their own archie.
Tommy?
One way to understand this is by thinking about how electricity works. Let's say you have a power strip plugged into an outlet in your wall. The power strip has power because it draws that power from the source, in the same way that Adam has life. Because like any created thing, he receives it from the Arche. Trying to become one's own God is like unplugging the power strip from the wall and plugging its port back into itself. You might do this as a joke, but it obviously doesn't work because a power strip isn't a power source. Plugging it into itself cuts it off from having any power at all. What happened in the fall is something along these same lines. Death and suffering coming into the world was less like a punishment for disobedience and more like the natural consequences of humans attempting to change their being in a way that clashes with the nature of reality. In this case, the nature of reality is that created things are dependent on the one uncreated thing, the Arche, for their life and being. This act had many effects. Cut off from the Arche, man began to die, not immediately, but gradually. To return to our electricity analogy, this is like unplugging a laptop or a cell phone from power outlet. The battery has some power saved up from when it was plugged in, but eventually it will run out. The rest of creation is also affected by this change. First is the ground for your sake, Genesis 3:17. The reason for this has to do with man's relationship to creation. God made man the crown and leader of creation to guide and cultivate it. This is why God gives Adam intellectual work to do in the garden, such as naming the animals. If man is the power strip plugged into the wall socket that is our key, then the rest of the creation is like a bunch of other devices plugged into the power strip that is man. When the power strip gets unplugged, the rest of those devices lose power as well. The Genesis story is complex and contains many levels of meaning beyond what we've discussed here. But for the purpose of articulating the core ideas of sacramental Christianity, I want to focus on this issue. The main thing that happened in the fall was man's voluntary act of separating himself from God, which God permitted out of his respect for man's free will. But because God is the Arche, then the act of man separating himself had profound consequences for mankind and for the rest of the world.
That's a good summary of, a good explanation of the importance of the fall from an Orthodox perspective. Anybody have any
So
questions?
Jesus Christ is the script that gets us plugged in back to the Arche.
You could say that, yeah. Yeah. And not just in an external way, but at the level of our very being, by taking on human flesh. All right, anybody else have any thoughts, questions?
Just like light bulb, like I've never heard it explained that way.
Yeah,
Ever, makes more sense
yeah. Agree.
This would be good for the poems.
for sure. For sure, yeah, the analogies are easy to understand.
Real
Yeah.
simple.
What do you got?
It is hard to think why such harsh punishment for eating an apple.
Right.
So this makes a lot more sense.
I love it.
All right, so we'll pick up on 38 next time. All right, so next week I won't be here. If you guys wanna meet without me, that's
No,
fine.
thank you.
But, all right, so we'll meet in 2 weeks.